I first heard about Darlene Rose being here a couple months ago from Tom and Jan Kendall, and Tom was telling me that they had just taken her book, Evidence Not Seen. I know many of you have said you have read that, and they had used it in their family devotions. And he said the children, all of his children, he has 7, from ages 4 on up to 20, were just spellbound by the book and received such a blessing from it. And then Jan says, oh, if you could, you should get her at your church. And I just thought, oh, this would be so wonderful. She's only in Greenville like a couple of months. And so I called her, and her husband, Jerry, has been very sick, and we didn't know if we were going to be able to work it out or not. But I'm just so thankful that we were able to get her here. It was like several days later, I was at the wallpaper store, and I ran into a friend of mine, Leslie Fricky, and she said, excuse my face, it's all red, and my eyes are swollen, but I just heard Darlene Rose speak at a luncheon. And she said she was just such a blessing to me, and it just seems like almost weekly I've heard people that have heard her speak, and we just are very honored to have her. We do have the books for sale at the end for $13 if you're interested in that. And Mrs. Rose said she'd be glad to sign them at the end if you would like for her to do that. We also are video and audio taping. The videos will cost $5 and the audios $2 if you're interested in signing up for that. Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Deibler Rose.
If I were to choose a text with which to preface what I'd like to share with you tonight, would be the words of the psalmist. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. I had not even heard about missionaries when I was a little girl, and I hadn't even come to know the Lord myself. But I went to Sunday school, and after the Sunday school meeting, I would always wait and ask my teacher why it was that I had no peace in my heart. And she would just pat me on the head and say, honey, just do the best you can. That's all God expects of anyone. And that's not what God is looking for. And our neighbor, and that's way back when. You see, I'm 80 years of age. And way back then, there weren't many people that had radios, but our neighbor had gotten one that was, some of you might remember those little ones with a lot of batteries that you had, and she said, you know, you really must come and hear this gentleman on the radio, because, oh, I've never heard a preacher preach like he does. And so it was early in the morning, he was on the radio, and he was one of the first ones that ever started to give gospel messages over the radio in the Midwest. And so I went over there with my mother, and they were telling about the wonderful missionary meetings that they had, and about missionaries that had been up in China, and one had been in India, and one had been in Africa. And this man's name was Dr. R.R. Brown. You may have heard of him. He was one of the early ones that really felt that missions was a part of the church that had been neglected. And so I said afterwards, shall I put it down? Am I being heard now? And so Dr. Brown was saying that morning about these missionaries and what a wonderful time they had had in Boone, Iowa, my hometown. And he said there was those from India and China and also from Africa. Well, when we left that day and went outside and I was ready to run off to Sunday school, this other Sunday school, I said to my mother, what is a missionary? Mother said, well, I don't really know. She said, I think it's those that couldn't make it at home, and so they go out to teach poor heathen people. A lot of people have that idea, but I tell you something, you really need a little bit between here and here if you're going to be a missionary. And so I said, and they said the Midway Tabernacle? I said, what's that? And Mother said, well, I think it's built sort of after, the churches maybe that they had way back when. So the second time we heard this gentleman, we felt we wanted to go to that church and see what their teachings were. It was February in Iowa. Blizzard was blowing. My mother and I walked 4 miles to get to that church. Great big barn doors on the front of it, and I couldn't get the one open because of the winds blowing, but somebody on the inside saw that someone was struggling with that door, and they came and then opened it up. I only remember about the message that was given that night. It was about Joseph down in Egypt. And before there was any invitation given at the end of the service, my mother stepped out and was on her way to the front. And I thought, if this is the thing that my mother needs, this is what I've been looking for. And I stepped out and I went down to the front. And for the first time in a lifetime, I heard my Lord say, my child, your sins are forgiven. Go and sin no more. It was not long the way home, going through a blizzard. The joy of the Lord was in our hearts. We got out the Bible and dusted it off, and Mother and I knelt beside a little rocking chair that we had there, and we began to pray for our family, and we would name them over before the Lord. And first, my sister came to know the Lord, and then one brother, and then my father, and then the other brother, until all of us knew the Lord. And I could hardly wait for the time to come when they would have their next missionary meeting. I was then 8 years of age, and I was in the back. The place was packed out, and I was sitting the next row to the back. And when they were, and Dr. Brown was there, and when they gave the invitation for those that would dedicate their life for the foreign field, I wanted so much to go down there, but they were looking for older young people, those that were coming to the end of high school and going into college. And I just thought, if I were older, I would go down there, and I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I turned around, and there was no one there, and I knew it was my Lord. And I looked up into his face that night, and I said, Lord, I would go anywhere for you, no matter what it costs. Be careful of what you say to God. But I knew from that moment on that someday I was going to be on the mission field. And I figured that I would need to know this Bible, and so I started in that night when I first came to know him, on my knees beside the bed with this book, and I started at Genesis 1, and I know most of this book. There were a lot of the begats, and so I got begats and begats, you know. I didn't bother about those. But I did not know at that time when I was putting this book in my heart and in my mind that someday my Bible would be taken away from me. I found it a wonderful opportunity to minister to other people, even when I was a little girl. And I heard somebody say something on the radio today about if you've had money problems, do you remember when you first had money problems? I do. It was the day after I found the Lord as my Savior. And I remembered that the people across the street from us, that he had dropped a penny on the porch. And I waited till he went inside, and I stole that penny. And when I got home, the Lord said, you need to straighten that out. So I, the next day, went over to see this man. I was scared to death. And he was an older man, and I said to him, I have something that I need to tell you about. And I had taken some bottles up to the store and turned them in. Mother said I could do that. And I had this penny with me. And I said to him, I want to tell you that before I came to know Jesus, I stole a penny off your porch. The man laughed at me because he had lots of pennies, but I had to do it. And I tell you, I never took another penny that didn't belong to me. I was so humiliated when he laughed at me, but it was good. And I wanted to do everything that would please my Lord. And when I got into high school, because I had memorized this book, and my teacher was telling us about the Darwinian theory. And when she had finished, I was really shaking, but I put up my hand. I thought, I've got to say something. I've got to straighten this thing out for her and the rest of the students that were in the class. And when she said, Darlene, what is it? And I said, I would like to say something. And I stood up and I said, what you have told us today is only a theory. They have to this day never found anything that made that to be a true statement. And I said, now, and then I quoted the first chapter of Genesis. I said, now that is truth. And I said, God didn't even want us to wonder about these stars. You know, they have all kinds of theories about stars. He said, and I said, he put that little statement in there, and he made the stars also. That's my God. Well, just then the bell rang, and she said, Miss McIntosh, would you wait a moment? And so everybody else went out. She turned around, she came over, and there were tears on her cheeks. She said, I wanted to thank you. I could not have said what you said this morning. But before I had graduated, there were many of the students that were in my class who had come to know Jesus Christ, and 2 of my teachers. And I realized that I really had something to share with people. And I knew that I wanted to be a missionary and that God had called me. And so I made everything, every arrangement for going to the Bible college in St. Paul. I knew that I would have to work out in a home because we were quite poor. And we didn't have the money for me to stay in the dormitory. But that was all right. I didn't mind that. It was good training for me. And I got my food. I got lunch to take the next day. I did all the cooking and all of the work except the sheets, and she sent those out because they didn't have a very large washing machine. He was a banker. I got all my streetcar tokens from them and $1 a week, and I thought I was rich because I had money for hose, and that's all I really needed. And to buy. And so I I loved it. I was soon singing in the chorale and was on a trio in other places. I loved going down in Seattle, in the city, because just underneath of the bridge that was between St. Paul and Minneapolis, there were a lot of people who were Negroes. And I had grown up with Negroes in Boone, and I loved them because they were very dear people. And they had a house that was not very far from ours. And so it was a real joy on Sunday nights to go down in among those people and share the Word of God with them and see them come to the Lord. And then in the year before I graduated, I was asked to be one of the speakers in a youth rally that they came from 5 different states there in our area. And I had spoken, and then I went down and sat on the front seat, and then a missionary from Borneo was there as the missionary speaker. And he was a very fine speaker. And he told about in less than 10 years, God gave us more than 10,000 believers among the cannibals of Borneo. And then because I wanted to see so many from the other 5 states of young people that I had come to know through the years, I started dashing off down the aisle like there, and a lady from the church grabbed a hold of me and she said, "Wait a minute." And I turned around and here was this missionary standing there. And she said, "Mr. Deibler, I think this is somebody you would like to meet. And she's one of our girls and she's going to be a missionary." And then she left me. And I said to him, "I really appreciated your message. I was very thrilled at the knowledge of the people that you had worked with that had come to know the Lord." And I said, "If you're ever in St. Paul," because I was on the mission committee there in the college, I said, "be sure and save a Friday night for our missionary meeting." He said he would do that. So I turned and dashed off. Well, I went back to college, and this was for the last year there. And one day, toward the end of the year, we were going to have a missionary conference. And I heard that this missionary was coming. And so I thought, well, that's great. He'll be here for the Friday night meeting. And this man came into the school there. And have you ever had a feeling that somebody was looking at you and you didn't know who it was? Well, Mother and Daddy had gotten together enough money for me to stay the last 2 weeks in the dormitory. And I looked around at the tables and nobody seemed to be looking at me, and so I looked up at the faculty table, and there was that missionary. And he was nodding, and he was smiling, and I thought, "Why are you doing that?" And I was really quite embarrassed. And then I thought, when they were all dismissed and everybody was going out, I thought, he's still up there, and I'm not going over there. And so I turned around and I stuck my head through the pass-through into the kitchen, talked to the old cook. And I every once in a while I'd look like this, and he finally was gone. So then I went sailing out of the dining room merrily, and I just got through the doors when somebody grabbed my arm, and it was the dean's wife, said, "Miss McIntosh, this gentleman would like to meet you," and introduced me to this gentleman again, Mr. Deibler. Well, then she disappeared. And he said to me, "I have just seen your folks down in Boone." And I said, "Well, that was nice." And he said, and then I went over to Nebraska, and he said the pastor and his wife were there, and I saw your picture on the piano and found out that his wife was your sister. Well, I realized then afterwards that whatever my father and mother had not told him, they filled him in. And I didn't know at the time that he already had my father's permission to marry me if he could win me. Well, all things were working against me, or maybe they were working for me. So anyway, then when he said, I've seen your father and mother too, and your sister, and I said, that was nice. Then he said, "Do you know anybody from Boone, Iowa that would be sending anonymous letters to me?" Well, I thought he was inferring that I had been writing anonymous letters to him. And I said, "Mr. Deibler, I have never written an anonymous letter to anybody, and I don't ever intend to. If I write a letter, I put my name on it," and I started to dash off. But here he came, and he said, I didn't mean that you were. He said, later he said, "I was just trying to make talk. I didn't know what to talk to you about after I discussed your family." Well, that night, and I was singing in the chorale, and we had the bus, and I got on the bus with the other girls, and we all went over to Minneapolis because the big meeting was being held in a large theater there in Minneapolis. And when I sat down in the front, there he was sitting on the platform, and he was smiling and nodding to me. And I thought, now, why does he do that? Everybody will notice that. And I decided I wasn't going to look up there anymore. He was a very fine speaker. He really was. He was an excellent speaker. And then when the meeting was over, I saw him coming right down those steps. So I scooted out one of those little doors they have, side doors in the theater, and I was walking along, caught up with the other girls, and all of a sudden I felt somebody take my coat and was pulling on it. And I turned around, and there he was, smiling. And he said, I want to take you out to dinner tomorrow night. Oh, I said, I can't do that. I said, I am catering a birthday party, and I did this to make extra money for the school. And I said, I couldn't be back here before 6:30. He just looked me eyeball and eyeball. He said, I'll see you at 6:30 at the front door, and he walked off. I thought, that's what you think. Well, I got on the bus. When I got on that bus, the other girls were all discussing that man. And one of them said, oh, did you notice that beautiful brown wavy hair? And another said, and those fingers, he's got the longest fingers. I bet he plays the piano. He didn't. And she said, and one of the other, whose father was very wealthy, and she had everything that opened and shut, she said, oh, she said, I'd give my right leg to have a date with him. I thought, well, all of you would like to, and you can't, and I can, and I don't want to. But have you ever played one up on you? I did. So I finished the birthday party, had the dishes done, and got on the streetcar and was back there at 6:30 in the evening, and he was waiting for me. So we went to Chinese restaurant. Now, girls, look out for Chinese restaurants. Both of my husbands have proposed to me in a Chinese restaurant. Well, we got to the restaurant, and we talked about this and that and the other thing, and in the middle of the meal, he put down his fork, and he said, and I tried to think of something really trite, and I said the wrong thing. I said, penny for your thoughts. He said, do you want to know what I'm thinking? And then I didn't know if I did or not. He said, I love you, and I want to marry you. And then I laughed. I said, you don't even know me. Oh, yes, he said, I know a lot about you. And he said, I'm coming back in the summer, and I will see you again. Well, he did. He came back in the summer, and even though I realized after that evening when he said that, and he put his hand on my arm, I looked over in those big brown eyes, and I knew that I would go anywhere in the world with that man, but I had to check it out with my Lord first. And when I got back to the school, the next morning, very early, there was a letter from him saying again that he loved me, he wanted to marry me, and that he would be back in the summer. And so then I got a phone call from him, and he said, I have discussed it with the board in New York, and he said they would like to have you come to a summer conference in Beulah Beach, Ohio. And my father got me a ticket on the Chicago Northwestern. He worked for the Chicago Northwestern. And I went there, and I met all of the dignitaries, and I was questioned about everything. And I guess I passed well. They already had everything from the school, the college where I had been. And they came out, the president of the alliance came out and said, we already have an apartment in our home for you. We want you to stay with us. And he said, you have our permission. We would like you to get married very soon so that you can then come and be there and be set up in New York. And so I made my bride's dress. I made everything. And it was a wonderful wedding in Boone, Iowa. And the friends that were there cooperated. I felt very sad about leaving my mother, We were very, very close. We were the first two that came to know the Lord. And so I said to her, Mother, I feel rather sad about leaving you. She said, honey, don't feel sad. Be glad that just after I came to know the Lord, she said, one day I saw in my mind's eye you with a group of black people, and you were telling them the gospel. And she said, that day I put you on the altar and said, Lord, she is yours. And it's your responsibility to work within her. I'm glad my mother didn't tell me that. Because knowing my mother, I might have thought, well, I really should go as a missionary because Mother thinks I should. I'm glad Mother never told me until I was on my way. And at 19, I was on a ship starting out for Holland because the Dutch East Indies at that time, they wanted the people that came there to be able to speak Dutch. And in 3 months, I was fluent in Dutch. We got to the field, and we had heard about these newly discovered people up in the heart of New Guinea. Now, nobody had even thought that there were people living up there. We have snow-capped areas that are snow-capped year-round up there. And one day a plane was coming across the what we call the neck of it, and they saw these 3 lakes. But the thing that amazed them was there were men and women rowing canoes on those lakes that the world didn't know about. And when that was noised around the world, immediately when we heard of them, we began to pray that the Lord would give us understanding of His perfect will when we got to the field. And we felt that God wanted us to go to those people that had just been found. And when we got to the field, they said, we'd like you. And a letter from the field chairman crossed ours in the mail, and he said, we'd like you to consider going to New Guinea instead of going back to Borneo. So it confirmed to us that that was the will of God for us. When I got there, and of course, if you're going to be among the people, you must learn their language and be able to communicate with them. And the day after I arrived at the headquarters, they said, your teacher is here already. Well, I hadn't even gotten anything unpacked, and so I went out, though I was listening to everybody that I could hear that was speaking Indonesian. And when I got in this little room that they had set off for those that were studying the languages, this little fellow, he was all dressed in a nice white suit, and he walked in and he bowed to me like this. He said, Selamat pagi, Nyonya. And I thought, well, slam it or whatever that was. And I didn't respond because I didn't know what to say to him. So he went out the door, and while he was going out the door, I thought, you know, he was trying to greet me. So when he came back in and he said, Selamat pagi, Nyonya, I was ready for him. When he said, Selamat pagi, Nyonya, I said, Selamat pagi, Nyonya. He said, oh, bukan saya ini, bukan Nyonya saya ini, Tuan. And I thought, what did I say? And then he pointed to me and he said, Nyonya. He pointed to himself and he said, Tuan. I had said, good morning, Mrs. to him. And he said, no, I am not a Mrs. I am a Mr. And I never called a man a Mrs. after that. But in 3 months, I was fluent in Indonesian, and I was teaching in our Bible college there. I love those people. They're the dearest people you could ever meet until you meet our headhunters, our cannibals from New Guinea. They're wonderful people, and I guess wherever God sends you, they're wonderful people. Love them. And so then, because there you couldn't fly in and drop down on the lake. They didn't have any watercrafts there at all, and the planes that could land on the water. And so they had to walk in. So my husband went over, and you cross 14 mountain ranges on the way into the interior. And there had been some Dutch people that had gone there. The Dutch police commissioner died the first day on the trail. And so they had brought him down. And there was another missionary with my husband, and he said, if he couldn't make it, I will never make it. And so he just left on the ship and left my husband alone. And he got some of the men from the coast to agree to walk with him and carry up some supplies into the interior. It took 18 days and crossing these 14 mountain ranges, broken bottle limestone, if you know anything about it. About the first or second day, you realize that you need something like cleats or something on the bottom of your shoes, because it just cuts your shoes. It's just like walking over broken glass. And my husband had gotten into the interior. There was no way to communicate, no way to send letters out at that time. And after about 3 weeks, I heard that he was being brought out to the north coast, and I wondered why he was coming out at the north coast instead of going back to the south coast. And he got on a ship there, came back to the island where we had our headquarters, Celebes, and when he came down the gangplank of the ship, I hardly recognized him. 60 pounds in those 18 days on the trail. And he had to be helped. He had a problem with his feet. I didn't know what it was till we got back to the house. When he took off his shoes and his stockings, there wasn't any skin on the feet. He had gotten what they call jungle rot. And I heard that during the war, they told the boys if they ever were caught in the jungles of New Guinea to make sure that they didn't try to walk on any of the mountains there. And one thing that they could remember was that if you're lost in the jungle and you don't have food, you pull apart the rotten trees there, and we have great big witchetty grubs, about that long, about as big as my thumb, and they're not bad. So when I've never refused anything the people have ever given me to eat. It's not something to be proud of. I just was made that way. And the others, they laugh at me and wonder why I eat all that stuff that the people give me. But it gave me an entree into the hearts of those people that others didn't have. They said, we know those that really love us, and we know those that think our food is bad. But you'd be surprised at how good some of those things are. And I had one dear little woman that early in the time that I was there, I led to the Lord, and she would bring me these freshwater crayfish. Well, she'd cook them over the fire, and then she would break the head off, and you have like liver-like, and it's quite bitter. And I said, oh, that is really bitter, isn't it? So after that, she sucked it off for me and then handed it to me, and I ate it. But I was so excited about knowing what he had learned about those people up there in the interior. And one thing I knew was that he had learned enough of the language so that being in the chieftain's house one night, he was trying to explain about God, about his Son, the sacrifice of the Son, and the shedding of blood for the remission of sin. And this old chieftain said, you don't know how many times when you've been here and told us about Yetoti, Jesus, that we have sat around this fire and would say to one another, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was someone like their Jesus that would give his life for us, that we could know him? He said, but you're not like us because you are, well, you don't any of you have a wife. None of you have children. So you're not human beings like us. And my husband had tried to explain to him that he had a wife in the outside world. He said, if you had, she'd have been here, she'd been on that. He said, but men died on the trail. Then she would have made it. Wherever we go, women go, they carry the loads. So if you had a wife, she'd have been on that trail bringing your supplies in here. And I thought that was a good idea. And so he had tried to explain this to him. And, well, they just couldn't accept it because nobody, not even those that were with the expedition that came in, had a wife, and none of them had children. So how did they come into existence in the first place, they'd say? Well, I was dressing Russell's feet one morning, and the doctor came, and he said, now, you see this, the skin and the flesh here begins to slough off. He said, you're going to have to take the tweezers and rip it off till you get down to the raw, throbbing flesh underneath, and then you put out this medicine on it. I was dressing Russell's feet one morning, and Dr. Jaffrey, our field chairman, dear man of God, he had been years and years up in China, then came down and opened the first evangelical work in French Indochina, and then came down to the Dutch East Indies and saw the multitude of islands there with no one telling them about God. And so Dr. Jaffrey had known what it was to be with the bandits up in China. Once they had reported that he was gone, nobody knew where he was. But they finally said he could leave, and only God would have brought him out. So Dr. Jaffrey had known what it was to suffer and be on trails. And when he walked in that day, and I was dressing Russell's feet, and the blood was running and the pus was running, and I saw a look of nausea go over his face. And he just turned around and he walked out, never said a word to me. And at lunchtime, I called him for lunch, and he said, I'll not be out until later. In the afternoon, he came out and laid a manuscript on the table in front of me, and I sat down to read it. He said, this morning I watched a young missionary dressing her husband's feet, running with pus and blood. He said, all I could think of was, what a nauseating sight that is. But he said, as I walked out of that room, the Lord said, oh, but to me they're beautiful feet. He said, I saw it, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of those that bring a message of hope and life to men and women that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. He said, one day, some missionaries going over the last mountain range, someday, that missionary will go down into a village of people who have never heard the name of Jesus. Someday, someone is going to give the message of redemption through Jesus Christ to that last person. And then he said, the clouds will part asunder and Jesus will be there. I've never crossed a mountain in New Guinea, but what I stood at the top of it and said, Lord, is this the last mountain range? Someday it will be the last mountain range. When that cloud parts asunder, our Lord is there. What a glorious day it will be. But I know that there will be our people from New Guinea there to greet him also. After Russell's feet were healed, he went back, but this time he had metal cleats put on his boots because the others were just cut to shreds. He went back because they would not allow women. They said men died on the trail, and up until that time there was no way to get in there because the planes were gone that had been with the expedition that had been in there. And so he went, and the people from Borneo whom he had led to the Lord heard about the problem of the trails in New Guinea. And they sent word to Dr. Jaffrey and said, "Our Father, the one who taught us about Jesus and had been the one who had fed our spirits, we hear that he's having trouble on the trail over there. So we have a group and we call ourselves Burden Bearers for Jesus. Now we want to come and help Mr. Deibler." And so they arrived. I have never heard such music as those Dayaks. They had 5-part harmony. They stood up there with their long, they wear a skirt, and they had little tiny caps on there. And when they sang on their heads, I tell you, I've never heard music like that. And all I could do was just sit there and weep. It was so beautiful. And then we said goodbye to them. They went to New Guinea, and they went up that trail, and they worked on it the whole way up. So it was really much, much better. When I finally got permission to go, I said to Mr. Jaffrey, Dr. Jaffrey, I said, I know that if I go now that I'm going to get permission, because I had heard that the people thinking that they'd like to try out some of the people. They said if we could shoot one of them, and if they bleed, and they have beautiful arrows and they have beautiful spears, and if they bleed, well, then we'll know that they're human beings like we are. Well, a government party was going across the lake, and so a group of the natives there started to shoot their arrows into them, and of course the police turned around and they killed 7 of our people. And then things were very bad. And so I knew until a woman went up there to show them that we were human beings just like they were, that we would never get the message to them. I went to see the governor on the island of Ambon, and that's sort of the jumping off place just to the other islands that are around there. And I told him where I wanted to go, and that dear man said, "When can you leave?" And I said, "Well, I have everything ready." And he said, "Well, you'll have to go down and talk to the man who is captain of the government white boat," they called it. It was a little schooner that went down to the south coast of New Guinea. And he said, if he'll take you, then, and this is the time of the west monsoons, and the weather's not very good. But I went over to see him, and when I told him where I wanted to go, he said, "That's fine. When can you leave?" I didn't even have to tell him why I should go and why he should permit me to go. I didn't have to tell him a thing. He just was thrilled to think I was going to go. And he put his hand across the desk, and he took mine. He said, "I want you to know that I love the Lord. Every day you're on that trail, I'm going to be at this desk praying for you." Another sign that God was in it, and the timing was right. When I got to the island of New Guinea, we came around the west coast, and you know, it was the west monsoons, and that little boat was going like this. Now, I've been around the world several times on ships, never been seasick, but I tell you, I never came closer to it than I did on that little schooner. And it was not only going like this, it was going this way too. But I said, "Lord, you calmed the Sea of Galilee. It's nothing to you." Because the captain had said, if it doesn't calm down, we'll just have to take you on down, about a 3-day trip then, and we'll be coming back in maybe a month, and it's always calm at that time of year. And I thought, Lord, I don't want to waste a month going down to the south coast there. And so when we came even with the village of Uta, it was as calm as glass. They unloaded our things into a lifeboat, and I was rowed around a sandbar, and my husband was standing there waiting for me. We got some canoes that we rented from the people there, and there were men that said they would accompany us up until we got to the first of the places where the natives were going to come down, because the captain, the head man of the village, had said to my husband, "If your women are that weak that they can't bring your supplies in for you, I'll send some of our young men down there to help them." Well, I was waiting for this. I was so excited, and I loved everything. I don't know anything about missionary life that hasn't been a joy to me. And I was enjoying everything. I saw the biggest crocodile you ever saw laid out there on the shore, and little sandpipers picking its teeth. And I thought, that's amazing. And I had 4 men in the forepart of the canoe. That picture on the front of the boat is me sitting in that canoe. And I would tap these fellows, and I was asking questions all the time. And they'd turn around and answer me. And I said, do they ever overturn the canoes? Yes, they do. And he said, just jump for the shore. And I was ready from that moment on to jump for the shore. Well, we slept on the shore that first night, and no crocodiles came in our beds. The next day we started on, and about halfway up, these 4 men yelled something, and they jumped out, and they were struggling with something, and something was flopping around in the water there. And I got up and I looked at the shore, and I knew I wouldn't make that in one spring, so I just sat down again. And then he came up, and he had the biggest stingray I have ever seen. They killed it, and they said, you know, this is the best meat you'll ever eat. And they wouldn't give me any, so I don't know what stingray tastes like. But then we got in that afternoon into the camp, the base camp, and my husband said, there is a group of the young men that are coming down. They're going to help us in. They said, if that woman of yours is so weak she can't carry your supplies in, we'll send some of our young men down to you. He said they should be in sometime this afternoon. And I was waiting for them, and then all of a sudden, when I was sorting some things, I heard this. Oh, I was excited. I said, the Kapaukus, and he said, yes. And I ran outside, and there were some fallen logs there, and I got up on them so I could see them, and they came, and they went around and around, and they were yodeling like that. And then they said, stopped, and they said, where is that woman? And my husband pointed to me up on the log there. So they came up the better to see me, right up on the log, and they kept pushing my sleeve up, and they said, she said, same up here as she is there. He said, yes, she is. And then they started to feel all over here, you know. He said, now you've seen her. That's enough. And so I think they talked most of the night, but they were sorting out things. We started on the trip, and I always carry a pencil and paper with me, and I was enjoying this immensely. And I am a good walker. I still am. At 80 years of age, I could keep up with all the men on the treks. And I was thoroughly enjoying it. At night, we would come into these little lean-tos, and there's just some dry grass on the ground inside of them, and you sleep there. But you go first to the river, and you wash the mud off of your trousers, and then you go over your legs with either iodine, or you don't pull them off, because these leeches, if you do, you're going to have a bad ulcer there before you have gone many days on the trail. And so we had to get rid of the leeches, and you could burn them with a match or use iodine on them, and they drop off. And I'd been there, and I'd gotten in, and my clothes were wet by this time, and I put on my dry suit, and you sleep in that, and the next morning you're ready to go on the trail. And about 3 days, I noticed after 3 days, these men began, I was asking questions all the time, and I kept my word list, and finally they would say, I told you that before. And they were being quite rude to me, and I thought, what did I do that have made them this way? And then one of them said, why does that woman of yours always go, ooh, in the morning? He said, well, the clothes are cold and they're wet. And he said, well, tell her to throw them over, and we'll hold them over the fire for her. And so I would throw them over, and they would hold them over the fire, and I smelled like evening in the jungle all the way in. And But they felt so good because otherwise they were really icy cold and you put them on. So I'd go, ooh. And this one morning, the third day up, and he banged on that door. He said, Ega, quickly now, Mama, let's go. And when he hit the door the second time, I just pulled the pins out of my hair and I rolled down over my shoulder. And when that door fell in, this fellow said, oh, no, he said, oh, mother of mine, indeed you are a woman, no man ever had hair like that. And I said, thank you, Lord, that they haven't seen our hippies. And then he came in and he was yanking my hair and he yelled out to the rest, come and look at it, come and look at it, it is a woman. And so my hair was going in all directions. And finally my husband said, that's enough. And so then I rolled it up, pinned it up again, put on my jungle hat, and we started in. I enjoyed it. Oh, I loved the trail. I loved walking, especially with these people, because now they knew that I was a woman. We were human beings. Christ had died for them as well. And they said after the 8th day, and I had gotten up, and the boys said, now, tomorrow we will come into our area, the last mountain range. And I was so thrilled. And I was ahead of some of the others, and my husband was behind me. And when I came over the top of that mountain, I looked down and I saw all these beautiful people running up the mountainside and yodeling to me. And I got down there. Everybody gave me a gift that day, and everybody gave me the same kind of a gift. It was roasted sweet potato. They were really very good. They roast them in the fire. And I had so many of them, I just sat down on the mountainside there. And then they tapped me on the shoulder and said, our head man is coming there, Kapaga Abdukpa. And I saw this little old fellow, and he had a bunch of arrows in one hand, and he had his cane in the other hand, and he was coming up the mountainside. And they said, the woman is here, the woman is here. He came over there, and he stood in front of me. And I saw what he was doing. He was looking at my khaki trousers and shirt. He looked up. My husband had just appeared over the top of the mountain. He had that same kind of a shirt and same kind of shoes, and he was wearing a hat, and I had a hat on, a jungle hat. It was about this big. It was good for rain or sun. And he looked down at me and he said, Akiyaga Mome, are you a woman or not? And I said, yes, I am. He turned down his lower lip. He said, Bail, you're not. And some of the boys came up and they said, quickly, let your hair down. So I let my hair down, literally that was, before these people. And I pulled the pins out of my hair. When it rolled down over my shoulder, he said, oh, no, he said, you are a woman, indeed you are a woman. And then he was feeling around in all of the sweet potatoes that they'd given me, and I realized he was looking for one still warm from the coals of the fire. And he took they have the nicest little paring knife on the end of their thumb. Their nail gets to be that big. And he had peeled it like that, and he'd gotten it all clean, and then he handed it to me. He said, Yagamono, woman, eat the potato. I took it from him. And I didn't have enough of the language at that time to tell him what I wanted to say. So I said it in English. I took it from him and I said, someday, by the grace of Almighty God, I'm going to sit down and eat with you anew in my Father's kingdom. And I saw the day when he passed from death to life in Jesus Christ. Oh, what a joy it was to be there. We went to all the villages, and we always had a group of little kids with us, and I came to the house that the Dayaks who had arrived and had helped my husband to build a little house there. And it was beautiful. It was with bamboo mat walls and tree bark roof, and it was air conditioned. The air came through most any place. And I loved it. It was beautiful. I always kept the door open because I wanted anybody that was going to buy to know that they were welcome to come inside. And this one day, a little fellow, he had live coals in his hands. I saw it, just looked glowing red, and I jumped up and I said, "What do you have there?" He said, "My father is dead and my mother is dead, and I'm your boy now, and I'm going to build your fire for you." And I did my cooking over an open wood fire out there all the time we were there. And he always was there in the morning to build my fire. All too soon, the word came about the war, that the Japanese were moving down closer and closer to the Dutch East Indies. And we knew that it would not be very long before these islands would be under the rule of the Japanese. And we were told we had to leave, that we could not remain there. We said, "But we could stay here." They said, "No, the government says nobody is to stay here." And so one day we had to close the house, and this little boy said, "Mama, I'm coming with you." And I said, "No, Imopai, you can't come." I said, "Because we don't know when we're going to be able to come back to you again. And I want you to be here with your own kind." He said, "Well, I'll walk away with you." And the second day, well, I knew that it would take him into the area where the mosquitoes carried. There were enough mosquitoes there that were the kind that brought malaria. And he had had malaria, and I had the answer to malaria. And I'd given him a cure before, and I said, "I don't want you to go down there and get malaria again." And I said, "You must go back." And I knew that the next turn on the trail would take him out of sight. And so I stopped and turned around and looked up at him, and I waved my hand, and he was crying. I could see it. Boys don't cry. He was wiping the tears off on his little bare thighs. And he said, "Mama, Ika Kada, come back quickly." And I said, "Imopai, as soon as I can, I will come home again to you." Never realizing how long it would be before I could go home to those that I loved so deeply. Because it wasn't very long before so many places were taken, and they were moving closer and closer and closer. We bought land for those that we couldn't get shipping for. We sent all of our students back to their own lands, their own islands, because we did not know how long the war was going to last. And then when we'd gotten everybody into a place where they could make gardens and be able to live, and then we went up into the mountains where the houses were used for the conferences. And when we got there, we realized that we're going to have difficulty getting food because it was not available, and the natives were moving away from the white people, and they were afraid. They had heard stories too of what happened in many of the areas. I'll never forget that day when they came and said, "We're going to take the men somewhere else." They wanted to know, and they weren't interested in people except those that were from America. And that day when they came in there, Mr. Presswood put his hands up. They use it everywhere as a signal for surrender. And they beat and beat and beat his arms. And my husband had put his hands down in front of the way he always did, and they beat his hands. And finally Mr. Presswood, who had worked formerly with Russell in Borneo, they worked together, he said, "Don't put your hand," he wants you just to put them down, drop them at your side. Then he wanted to know where each person was from. Well, when they came to Dr. Jeffrey, who was an elderly man, and he had been very sick before the Japanese arrived, he asked him where he'd come from. And he started to stutter, and he said, "Canada." And the man said, "Canada? Where is Canada?" And nobody told him. He wasn't interested then. "You could stay here." and then they were going to take the men because they were Americans. Even though Ernie Presswood was also a Canadian, they didn't ask him what country he had come from. But and if he had, maybe he would have stayed there too, but they didn't leave him. And they said, go get some things for them, because no suitcases. And I ran in, and the first thing I could see that I could put something in was from the bed. I saw the pillowcase, and I thought, I'll take that. And I began to put in things in the Bible and things that I thought my husband would need, and notebooks, pens, and as many clothes as I could get into that. And then I heard the trucks out there starting their engines. And I wanted to run out so that I could say goodbye to my husband. But the captain came from out of Dr. Jaffrey's room, and he said, what's wrong with that old man in there? I said, well, he has a heart condition. He's had diabetes. He'd been in a coma while he was down on the coast there first time. And I said, Bright's disease. And I began to name all these things. He laughed. He said, anybody that needs all the medicine that man has, he's not going to live very long anyway. He said, go tell him he doesn't have to go. So I ran in and I said, Dr. Jaffe, they said you don't have to go. And then I came out, and the truck was beginning to move off. And I handed the bag up to my husband, and I put my hand on the tailgate because I wanted to say something to him before he left. He just put his hand over my hand, and he said, I want you to remember one thing, dear. God said he would never, never leave us nor forsake us. And he was gone. Well, when I got back in, I thought, all the medicine, Dr. Jaffrey was diabetic, but all he had was a sugar substitute that he could get there. And I said to him, what were you putting in that little bag you had? It was a bag that had belonged to his father. He said, well, I was putting in all my eau de cologne, he said, because I knew that we would be taken out of the mountains and down to the coast. And he said, I like to use the eau de cologne, and he did, and he was one that advertised his birthday. His birthday was the 16th of December, and the 16th of January said just 11 more months till my birthday. And then it was 10 more months, and so on through the years, and we never forgot it because he always announced it, just one. And so we knew that it was very refreshing for him when on the coast to put that on his handkerchief, and he would put it over his face, and it is very nice. It really is cooling. And then I started to laugh how God had fooled that Japanese officer to think that was medicine. We needed a man there with us. We were right near, butted onto the village that belonged to these people who were called the pirates of the islands. They had beautiful, sleek little canoes, and they were very clever. And they would also loot the ships that were going along the coast. And people were afraid of them, the Bugis people. And I had, the year before, led one of the girls, one of the women, from that area to the Lord. And I had seen her that day, and we were saying, well, how are we going to get food? I said, we're just going to have to go in the jungle and find what we can, and any kind of seeds or things like that. And I saw them with all the children up there running on the mountainside and catching things, flying, big flying ants. And she came down, and she waited till she made sure that nobody was around. And she brought me a half of a coconut shell, and she had cooked those things in there in coconut oil. And so she said, I had the children getting these for you. And she said, I cooked them today. And she said, you like these? I said, not bad. I gave the first one back to Mother Nature, and then I thought, that's ridiculous. That wasn't bad. And so I ate the rest of them. Well, we had rats, and I hate rats. They would even chew our shoes, so we had to have them in a closet, someplace where they were protected at night, your clothes, anything. They would chew on them. They were very destructive. And, of course, these were not well-sealed houses there. And every night I said to Margaret Jeffrey, we've got to run the rats out of the bedrooms and get them into the kitchen, because it was the only room in the house where you could shut the door and shut off their exit. And so we would go through all the bedrooms and run them into that kitchen and then close that door, and then we'd go over here and get them out of these bedrooms. And we would fight those rats until we killed everyone. They run up the walls and they jump on you and we scream and yell. And but we didn't leave that kitchen until we killed everyone that we'd corralled in there. And then we carried these little creatures out. And this one night, I had heard noises all over the house. I thought we'd done a good job. And we'd gone to bed. And I heard sounds, it seemed like everywhere. And I shook Margaret Jaffrey's bed and I said, Margaret, we're going to have to get up and go out and light the lamps and have another go at the rats. I said, they're all over the house again. I don't know how they got in. And it wasn't those that we'd killed either. And so she said, and I got up, put my robe on, went to the door, and this bedroom opened onto the hall that ran from the living room down through to and the bedrooms were off of it, and through the bathroom and over there was a porch. And when I opened that door, I could see in the dim light of a little tiny oil lamp that we always kept lit for Dr. Jaffrey at night. And somebody just swooshed past me like that. And I turned around and I thought it was Dr. Jaffrey, and I looked, and here was one of those boogies men, and he pulled out that great big machete. It has a blade about like that. And there he was, and he stood like, I don't know why I did what I did. I do crazy things. But I just started down that hall after him, and he turned and looked at me, and I didn't have a thing in my hands. And he turned around and he yelled something, and he went through, and here I go chasing him through that bathroom and down over the porch and down over the mountainside. And then when I saw all those other people out there, I just stopped dead, and I said, Lord, what a stupid thing for me to do. And he answered me just like that. He said, the angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him and delivereth. I was so weak, I could hardly get back to the house, and I went to shut the door. They had carved out the nicest little porthole you ever saw. They're very clever with their machetes, big machetes. And by this time, Dr. Jaffrey was awake, and they all came out and said, what was it? And I said, we've had bandits in the house. And so there were curtains gone, tablecloths and things like that. And after the war, after 5 years it took me to get my health back, and I went back with my second husband, Jerry, and I said, I want to go up there, and I want to go down to that village, and I want to find out what happened that night, because we could hear them with their dogs coming back night after night, but they never even came up even close to the house. And I found a little fellow that had been a gardener for Dr. Jaffrey. And I said, during the time of the big fight, were you one of those that came to the house? And we heard you come back night after night, but you never came in the house again. And I said, we had no way to defend ourselves. And he looked at me amazed. He said, but you had all those people dressed in white standing guard around that house every time we came. You know who they were? The angel of the Lord. Well, it wasn't very long till they decided that we were living, as they said, too much luxury. I had a couple of letters that were brought by one of the officers, the Japanese officers. Very nice man he was, and he had been trained in America. And so he brought these letters to me, and I then learned that my husband was on the coast and he was in one of the prisons that had been made out of like the sanitarium for tuberculosis and other things. And then they came and said that we were going to have to be taken out of there, that we were living in much too much luxury. Well, we would go and we'd find seeds and things. We tried everything for eating. And finally, the trucks came for us. They said, you can only carry one suitcase. So I put on 3 sets of clothes, and then I put the others in a sleeping bag. And we got on the truck. I'm telling you, they would have won the Indianapolis 500 hands down. They could drive like idiots, going there with all these older people that we picked up on the back. And so we just stood, the young ones, like this, and tried to make like a fence around those older people that were there. And we would be swayed, and I grabbed hold of the hood of the truck, and was hanging on for dear life. And we finally got to the city of Macassar, and when we pulled up in front of this place, I realized it was where the sanitarium for people with tuberculosis had been. But they had put in these, they were about a half a block long. There were buildings made out of bamboo, woven bamboo mats, and tree bark roofs, and some of them had grass roofs. We had mud on the floor, and double-decker racks on which to sleep. It would accommodate about 100 people. And they said, this one is for all the foreigners. And that was Barracks 8. And when we got in there, I realized that I could speak 3 of the languages of the people there that were in this barracks with me. And so they said, well, since you speak them and you know the Indonesian language as well as Dutch, and we will be very grateful if you would be our head of the barracks. And so I took on that work, even though I was one of the youngest of them all. And we became the workforce of the Japanese. I have unloaded trucks. I had watched them down near the jetties when we would go down when the ships were coming in before the war. And I saw how the men rolled their shoulders over, and they'd throw these great big bags, heavy bags on our backs, and I would grab it and then walk off with it. And I tell you, if you didn't, you'd been caned until you got up on your feet and tried again. And those of us who were young decided we would do this heavy work and spare the older people and the sick people. We built roads for them. That was hard, heavy work. If you've ever seen any of the pictures, the hose that we were given was about this long, the head of it, and it was heavy iron. It was getting it up that was the problem. Once you got it up, it went down by itself. And but you had to be strong in order to do that kind of work. And then we had to clear land for them. We had to make gardens for them. We had machines brought in so that we could make their uniforms. We had to raise their pigs. Whenever the garbage came in from the men of the Japanese army, they wasted a lot of food too. But we'd say we'll give it the finger test. If it didn't fall between our fingers, it was big enough to eat, and then we would sterilize it over the fire. We were given drums in which to cook rice. We were up at 4 o'clock in the morning if you were on cooking rice, and I arranged it so that the younger women took the heavy work, and the older women could work in the machine, in making uniforms and knitting socks for them. And this one day when I went out, I 4 o'clock, and that morning as we're dipping out this was our breakfast, dipping out a big dipper full for the people, and everybody said, you know, it smells just like chicken soup, chicken rice soup. And I said, yeah, that's correct. It tastes like it too. Well, when it got light enough for us to see something, here came a rat tail up. And then there were feathers. And we kind of figured it out because there was a little shelf up there above this great big drum that we cooked in. And they must have had a bird there, and the rats came to get the bird, and in the fight they all fell into our tin. And as soon as it surfaced, then everybody went out and they were vomiting outside, and I said, boy, I've got it here, I'm hanging on to it. Well, then we took that shelf away so that nothing could fall into those big drums again. Well, I'll tell you, it was something else. Well, we had these pigs for the Japanese. And the camp commander would go out and shoot the dogs in the villages, and we would steal the liver from the dogs. It doesn't taste any different than pig's liver or cow's liver. But then when we could find things that we could eat out of the garbage, we'd take that along with us. And this one day, we found out that there had been somebody there that had brought in some sugar for someone in the camp. And he was a native man. And the camp commander had caught him in the grass. And he had a little bit of sugar that he was trying to get to someone. But he was a noble character. We had to all stand up in rows, and one by one, we had to go and face that man, and they were watching for any expression of recognition on the part of one or the other. And it was a terrible thing. Some of the women almost fainted. It was so frightening. And that young man, a native fellow, he would not recognize anybody. And the camp commander began to kick him with his heavy boots, and he kicked him, and he kicked him, and we had to stand and watch it. I said, I've seen bloodlust. I've heard about it. The second in command, he was just shaking because he wanted so badly to get in there and beat that boy too. The camp commander ordered him to stop. And they watched every one of our faces to see if there's an expression of recognizing the fellow. Well, and finally he stopped. And he picked the fellow up. I don't think there could have been a bone in that boy's body that was whole. So we decided as barracks leaders we were going to set up our own guard system. We told the camp commander that's what we were going to do. He said, all right. And so one night when I was on duty, I had made my first trip all the way around, and when I got to where the pigs were, and of course they'd scare you witless when it was a dark night and you couldn't see anything, and they would, when you came in there, and they'd all start grunting, and they were walking around on that beautiful floor. They had cement floors, and those had to be washed every day. And if anything was on there that shouldn't be, we had to carry more water to wash it off. They had to have a perfectly clean floor on which to walk, the pigs. And so this day when I came back this evening, and I walked clear around the camp, and then I came back, and I was near where the gate was, and somebody just raised up on the other side. Boy, my hair went up like that. And then I said, Siapa itu, who is that? And this fellow said, Saya, Nyonya. I said, yeah, that's right. They always say it is I. And I said, don't tell me your name. I said, I don't want to know your name. And I said, I just want to tell you something. I said, we're on guard duty because we do not want you, any of you, ever again to be caught by the Japanese camp commander. And I said, I want you to lift that grass up where you've been sitting, and I want you to get into the moat that surrounded our camp. And I said, you walk as far as you can in that water, and I said, you tell the people wherever you go, don't try to bring anything into us because you've already lost one man, and it isn't worth it. We don't want any of you to die for that. And so the boy took off. We had to report. He said, if you ever find anybody, then you report to us. Well, I don't know where he was that night, but I've always had a feeling that he was there somewhere watching what was happening, the camp commander. And so I got up there, and the second in command, oh, he was one to strut. He always had pistols, and he had several on, and then he had a lot of bullets on, and then he had a great big flashlight about that big, and I had to wait while he got all of his ammunition on and his several pistols that he had there. And I started out. Well, on the way down, he wanted me in the front of him. And so he was right behind me, and he was flashing that light around. And when finally we got down there, then I said, this is where the man was. And he looked, and he said, oh, yes, I can see. But he's not there now. And I said, no, he isn't there now. And so he said, we will go back now. And so then I was in rear guard. So I thought, you are nothing but a coward. That's what you are. You want us women to walk around here with absolutely nothing to protect ourselves with. And so I said, you're on the wrong place. I said, you're not. That's not where the trail is. So I took him because there was a big field of stick tights. And he had on these boots that were like those that the Gestapo wore. And they were nice boots, but above that, he had these nice socks on. He was so proud of those. And I took him through that field of stick tights, and I got up there where the lights were, and when he walked up those steps and saw all those stick tights and on his trousers, I knew he could have killed me. He turned around, he was so mad, and he was fooling around with his pistols, and he couldn't get one out. And I said, good night, sir. And I walked off as fast as I could. And when I got far enough away and I was in the dark, I said, Lord, I know you said do good to those that despitefully use you, but I couldn't resist that. I think the Lord had a good laugh over it, too. Anyway, I'm quite sure that Mr. Yamaji, our camp commander there, I'm sure he saw that, because he sent word that he wanted someone to be sent instead of that one that was there with us. And I had heard nothing from my husband for months. Dr. Jaffrey was taken away. And that day then, when they took him, I ran up to the gate, to the tailgate, and I grabbed hold of it, and I said, when you see Russell, will you give him my love? And he said, yes, I will. And then he looked at me, and he was a Scotsman, and I was a Macintosh. And he said, Lassie, whatever you do, be a good soldier for Jesus Christ. And I never forgot those words. And he was being taken away from us. And I said, when you see Russell, give him my love, will you? And with the man who came down to butcher the pigs, it was a priest. His avocation was butchering. And they needed somebody there to butcher the pigs. And so they brought him down, and with him was a little fellow, a little Japanese fellow. He was the nicest little fellow you ever saw. And he had the biggest feet, the longest feet I think I've ever seen. His feet were just about like this, and his legs were just about like that. And but he was so nice. And every day he seemed to find me somewhere, and he finally scared me. And all he would say was, "Good morning, Mrs." And I would say, "Good morning, sir." And then he'd find me somewhere else. And I said to some of the ladies, I said, "If you ever see him come, I don't know why he does that. He wasn't greeting other people like that." And so I said, "Please let me know." But somehow he would find me. And then I thought to myself when the priest came in that I would go and ask him how Russell was. And when every time I saw him, there were a lot of other women around there, and the Lord would say, "You can trust me. They need to hear about their husbands." I said, "You're right, Lord. Many of them don't know you, and I can trust you." And then one Sunday night, the priest said to those that were there in the worship service that the Catholics were holding, he said, "There's somebody in this camp, I can't tell you who it is, I don't care, I can't tell you anything about this person, but this person needs prayer, and if you know how to pray, pray for this person." Well, when some of the Catholics came back by, they said, "You know, the strangest thing, he asked prayer for somebody in this camp." And I closed every day in my barracks with my women reading the Word of God in their languages and then praying for them. I said, "Let's have another time of prayer for this person." The next day, Mrs. Joustra, the Dutch woman who was under the camp commander, and she came over and we talked about the work. And I said, "I still have some young women." I said, "I've already done 3 jobs today, but I said, I have some other young women that can help in doing the rest of the work that needs to be done if they're sick people. We'd take their place so that all the work would be done." And then she just stopped and she said, "But I didn't come to talk to you about the work." She said, "I came to tell you that your husband up in the camp in Pari Pari has been very ill." And when I saw the tears, I just grabbed her shoulders. I said, "Mrs. Joustra, you don't mean he's gone?" She said, "Yes, he died some 3 months ago up in the camp in Pari Pari." I said, "Thank you for coming to tell me." I turned around and I walked off where there's no one. And I said, "Father, I trusted you, and I still trust you. Was it necessary to take Russell?" And he said to me, "My child, I promised you that when you have passed through the waters, I would be with you. And these are the waters of sorrow. And I'm with you, my child." I said, "All right, Lord. Would you help me not to cry, not to make my sorrow the sorrow of other people? There's enough sorrow in this camp already." And I never again shed tears before anyone. But in the night hours, I would dream of him. I'd waken in the morning to remember that he was not there anymore. We had a group of them, the Japanese officers, that would come in the most beautiful limousines you ever saw. We called them the death wagons, because when they came, they took people. Some came back, some of them never returned. And those that did return never talked about what happened to them while they were gone. Then one day they came and they asked for Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley, my fellow missionaries. They were the only other Americans. And there was one that came later on from another island, but there we were, the 3 Americans. And they took those 2 women. And I said, "God, why would they want to take those 2 elderly women?" When that car left the death wagon, I turned around and went in. I said, "It's because they're Americans, isn't it?" we prayed for them, pleaded with the Lord that somehow he'd spare those elderly women, missionaries, godly women. And then one day, the death wagon came back, and our camp commander was accustomed to going out in the villages and shooting the dogs and coming back in, and every time he'd see that big death wagon coming, the limousine, he would jump on his bicycle and he'd be gone. And this day, I had put a dress on, the only time I'd ever put a dress on. But I don't know why I did it, and I'm sure it was the Lord put it in my heart, because he knew where I was going that day. And when I went over, after they called me, I went over, they were tapping things on the desk that was there. And I said, "Sir, if that is Morse code, I do not know Morse code." "Ha," they said, "we'll see what you know from Morse code." And I've had a difficulty in not learning other languages, because it wasn't good to have learned the Japanese language. You were immediately suspect. And so I didn't know anything about what they were saying, and they were watching every expression on my face, whether I was going to respond to something they were saying. But I didn't. I was blank because I wasn't hearing a word they said. I didn't know Morse code either. And they said, "Go and get another dress. We're going to take you somewhere else to examine you. We'll find out how much you know about Morse code." So I ran back to the barracks, and I grabbed a dressing gown. I remembered that Miss Kemp had just her work suit on, and the Lord, knowing where I was going, had put it in my heart to put a dress on. I don't know why otherwise. I came back, I got in, I got a soldier on either side of me, and two of them in front of me, all of them with their guns. And I was taken out of the camp, taken down to the city of Makassar, and when we pulled up in front of this one area that I remembered was a native insane asylum, as we pulled around, I saw in that first cell block Miss Kemp hang on to the bars of the window, and I could see her arms were black and blue. I couldn't see anything else, but she was shaking her head at me. And then I just said, "Lord, wasn't it enough you took Russell? Must I now go through this?" And so sweetly my Lord said, "It's those that I love that I discipline." I said, "All right, Lord." I said, "But help me never to shed a tear before them, no matter what they do to me." And I went through the next cell block. They took my Bible, first thing they grabbed. I'd had it hidden in my dress, and they saw it, and they took that, and they said, "You can't have that. You just sit in there and read that and not think about your evil deeds against the Imperial Japanese Army." What they didn't know was the little girl had memorized this word. It didn't matter that they took my Bible. It was there. That's why God put it on my heart as a little girl to begin to memorize this. I went through the next cell block, and I could hear Miss Seeley, and I knew her mind was completely gone. And then I followed the guards. They came over to this cell block. It was on the other side of an exercise ground. And I saw that one room was completely boarded up. The window was boarded up on the outside. And that's where the man stopped. He stopped there, he put the key in the door, and when he threw the door open, he put his hand behind me, and I looked up, and somebody had written in chalk, "Orang ini musti mati," this person must die. And the fellow put his hand in my back, and he shoved me in, and I hit the other side of the wall. And I turned around quickly and dropped on my knees because I was watching that key, the other side of the key. And when it made a complete revolution, and he pulled it out, I was locked on death row. I sat there and realized suddenly what I was doing. I was singing, "Fear not, little flock, whatever your lot, He enters all rooms, the doors being shut. He never forsakes, he never is gone. So count on his presence from darkness till dawn. And I did, from darkness till dawn, and from dawn till darkness again. I was on this cell. There was nothing in that cell. I was left for 3 days. I used my skirt. That was why I had that big skirt on. The Lord had put it in my heart to put that dress on. And anything on the floor, if you vomited on the floor, you ate it up. Fecal matter, you ate it. And I wept all the tears that I had not shed. I wept. When I had no more tears to shed, the Lord would say to me, "My child, I'm here." And he said, "I bottle up the tears. They're all bottled up. And I love you." I said, "Lord, whatever you do, make me a good soldier for you. Don't ever let me cry before them, no matter what they do to me." After 3 days, they came. They took me out. I was fed nothing, no water, in those 3 days. And then they took me out the next day to one of the regular toilets out in the back. Needs motion for me to go to that one. When I got over there and opened it up, there was so much fecal matter in there, just gushed out, and I jumped back because I had an ulcer on my leg. And there was a little native boy there, an Indonesian. He never looked at me, but he said to the officer, he said, "Would you want me to clean that out for you?" He just went like that. That little boy carried bucket after bucket after a bucket of water till he finally got it all down in, and the hole in the center was visible. And so I went in. There was no lock on the door, and I prayed, "Lord, please don't let anything happen now till I get back to that cell. When I get back there, Father, put it on somebody's heart to bring me something into this cell so I don't have to go out there again." I knew when the guard came the first time, was less than a cup full of rice. He spun it across the floor to me. I never was given a spoon or anything, so I had already learned how to eat rice with my fingers like the natives did. And I found that many a time there was maggots in there and worms. One day I thought that was fresh grated coconut on the top of this little bit of rice that was spun across the floor to me. And I said, "Oh, Joyce, somebody knows. I just love fresh grated coconut." But when I pulled the plate up, it wasn't coconut. They were maggots. Well, all the flies that were there because of the lack of anything that was sterile. And they would right onto my rice, and I'd try to get them off, and finally I just put the whole plate underneath of my skirt, reach underneath, and I'd get enough to get behind my finger, and I put it in my mouth. I wasn't going to share it with them. Then first I pushed the worms up on the side of the plate, and then I thought, maybe I'm getting some protein. Come along, I'll eat them all. So I ate the worms as well. And then the hearing started. I'll never forget the first time they took me to the hearing room. I said, "God, you help me to stand tall. Don't let me cry." I said, if anybody from America ever hears what how I conducted myself, I don't want my fellow Americans to ever be ashamed of me. And I would go there. One man sat here. They said I was an American spy. They had proof, every proof of it. And he said, you know what that is in the time of war. He drew his finger across his throat. He would send the letter, the inquiry into this fellow by the Japanese language, and this fellow in Indonesian would repeat it to me. I was told that I'd been caught, that they found out that I had a radio, that I had been sending word to the Allies, how many soldiers they had, where their ships were, everything. It was the most ridiculous thing you ever heard. I say, that's not true. No, I did not. I never heard that. I didn't go into the jungle. I didn't have a radio. I had nothing. No. I wasn't over there. I wasn't reporting to anyone. On and on. And he used judo chops on me. My eyes were blackened. And then many a time I was so sure my neck was broken when he would get me with the judo chops there, hurt my arm badly. And but I never shed a tear. But I'll be honest with you, when after 2-3 hours of that, I was lashed with a cane, and I would stand up and he'd go like this, that I could leave. And I walked down to with the one officer. He'd unlocked the door and shoved me into that room. When the door was closed and locked, I'd throw myself out on the floor. I wept buckets of tears. I said, Father, I can't go through another one. Please, Lord. I can't go through another one. And then I got cerebral malaria. I had beriberi. One day I had such a bad headache, and I was sweating from the malaria. And I put my foot on the doorknob, and I hoisted myself up with the bars of the window till I could reach the transom above the door. And I grabbed a hold of those irons there. And I was looking out. I just needed air on my face. I had such a high fever. And I saw that there was a group of the native women down there. They were there for minor misdemeanors. They were allowed to walk on that ground in the afternoon hours. And I saw that every time that guard went that way, this one girl just rush off this way. And once you hear him stomp those boots and turn around, then she would stop and be so relaxed you knew she hadn't been going anywhere. And so as soon as he turned his back on her again and was going off in this direction, there she went again. And I thought, why is she doing that? If she wants to go down there, why didn't she just walk down there? Well, the last time he went that way, she got over to that fence that was covered with Honolulu creeper, and a hand came through it, and on that hand was a whole bunch of bananas. And she put them under her sarong, and she walked away, and nobody knew she had those bananas, but I did. I could smell them. I got down on the floor, and I said, Father, I'm not even asking you for a whole bunch like she had. Could I have one banana? Then I tried to tell him how to do it. I said, well, there are 4 possibilities, Lord. I said, now, these are the 2 men that have been trying me. No, they wouldn't. They'd never bring me a banana. And I said, this is the one who is on duty out there now. No, he wouldn't either, Lord. And I said, this is the little fellow that's on night duty. He's an Indonesian boy. And I said, Lord, if you said something to him, I'm sure he'd try to get me a banana. But don't do that. Don't let him do that. Because if they catch him, that'd be it. So I said, there's no way that you could get a banana in here to me. And you know that I am grateful for this little bit of rice that I'm getting. Maybe I'm getting some protein with those worms, I don't know. And I said, Lord, but I'm grateful for that. The next day, I heard officers coming. I could always tell the way they scuffed their boots. And I stood up and I said, Lord, once more, I'm asking you, help me not to cry, no matter what they do. And I said, if it's back to the hearing room again, all right, don't let me cry in front of them. When that door opened, standing in front of me was Mr. Yamaji, our camp commander. And he was smiling. And it had been so long since I'd seen a friendly face of any kind. And when I saw him smiling, I just said, oh, Mr. Yamaji, seperti lihat sobat yang lama. I said, Mr. Yamaji, it's like seeing an old friend. The tears came in his eyes. Mr. Yamaji had spent 3 days, he told me later, in Makassar just to get permission to come in to see me. You see, that man had a change in his life, because when I had heard that my husband was dead, he called me that afternoon over to his office. And he said, Nyonya, this is war. I said, understand that, sir. He said, women in Japan have heard exactly what you have heard. I said, I understand that too. He said, someday the war will be over. He said, you're very young. And he said, you can go back to America and you can go dancing, go to the theaters and forget these awful days. And I said, Mr. Yamaji, may I speak to you? You never spoke to them without first asking permission, or they slap you across the face. I said, may I speak to you? And he pointed to a chair. He said, sit down. I said, Mr. Yamaji, I want to tell you about somebody. Maybe you have never heard of him. I said, his name is Jesus Christ, the Son of Almighty God, the Creator. And I said, I first learned about him when I was a little girl in America. And God gave me the most wonderful opportunity to lay the plan of salvation before that man. I said, that's why I don't hate you, Mr. Yamaji. I said, where the love of God is in the heart, there's no room for hatred. And I saw the tears start down over his cheeks, and he nodded. He had said, you're very young. Someday the war will be over. You can go home and you can go dance and go to the theaters. Forget these days. I said, no, Mr. Yamaji. I said, maybe he brought me here to tell you that God loves you and Christ died for you. The tears started down his cheeks. He stood up. He went in and he just nodded to me. He went into his bedroom and I could hear him blowing his nose and crying. I waited more than an hour because you never left their presence until they dismissed you. He didn't come out, and an hour had gone by. He didn't come out. So I walked out and I went back to my barracks. But the next day when that man came out, he was a different man. He had come to know Jesus Christ as his personal Savior. And I'm not saying this tritely, but if it was just for the sake of Mr. Yamaji, that one man, it was worth everything. And things began to change in our camp. And here was Mr. Yamaji. He told me later he had spent 3 days getting the permission to come in to see me. He went over and talked to those 2 men that had been trying me, who were so cruel. Then he came back and he said, I'm going back to the camp now. And he said, I have to have something to tell the women. Everybody's asking about you, wondering what has happened to you. I said, Mr. Yamaji, when you go back, you tell them for me that I'm all right, and they'll understand I'm still trusting in the Lord. And I said, Mr. Yamaji, you'll understand that too, don't you? And he nodded to me. Turned around, the door was closed, locked, he was gone. And I thought, Lord, as soon as Mr. Yamaji's gone, I'm going to be called again. And then I heard the guard coming. He unlocked the door and he walked in and he laid them all on the floor, and you know what they were, don't you? They were bananas. I just pushed them off. I said, I have no right to eat those. I said, here I was yesterday telling you that you couldn't get one banana into me. I don't know why I counted them, unless it's so that you might know the bounty of God's gifts. I'd asked for one banana and told him he couldn't get that into me. I sat down and there were 92 bananas. They were the small sugar bananas. Then I wanted to eat them all at once. I knew if I did, I'd be sick and I'd have to eat that off of the floor. So I said, Lord, help me so that I won't eat too many bananas and get sick. The day I peeled the last banana, the guards came, said, we're going to take you somewhere else. I got into the car, then they went and got Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley. We were taken to the headquarters. And when we got there, I don't know how we got separated, but I was there, the man who had been the brains of the two that were questioning me. He said, we have every evidence that you have been doing spy work. Then he drew his finger across his throat. It was the first time I'd ever seen him with his sword on. He grabbed the hilt of the sword and he started to pull it out. I think he thought I was going to be screaming and yelling. I wasn't, because my heart was singing, I'll live for him who died for me. And the Lord was trying to make me to know that he was yet to deliver me. And I said, Lord, that's a strange song when I'm going to die. And just at that moment, before that sword was completely out, somebody must have called his name. Cars were coming, screaming, yelling. Everybody was running all over that place. He came back in and grabbed me by the arm, took me out, threw me into the front seat of a little vehicle. Like top secret material. Margaret, Philoma, and I were being taken back to the camp. When I came back, we got just through the first gate, and he reached up. He almost broke my arm. He said if he started to twist it, and I almost bit through my lip trying to keep from screaming. The pain was so awful. He said, if you ever tell anybody anything that happened to you while you were down here, I'll get you the next time, and you'll never come out. I got back there when they opened up the car, and I said to somebody, I motioned for him to come and get Margaret, get Philoma, take him to the hospital. And I started to walk back to the barracks. Here came a woman that we had known was a spy. She tried to give me something. And I said, I'm not going to take that. She said, but I was in prison while you were down there. I said, no, you weren't. She said, yes, I was. And she said, this is from your friend, Visha. That was the daughter of the pastor of our church there. I said, no, I'm not going to take it. And she was just furious with me. She said, I risked my life to get this for you. And just then, Mrs. Presswood came out, and she said, what's the matter here? I said, she's trying to give that thing to me, and she says, it's from Visha. And I said, they told me that I have if I had any contact with anybody outside of this camp, that they'd get me again. And I never come out. And this woman, Mrs. Presswood, she came up there and she said, "You get out of here, or you don't know what's going to happen to you." And then all of the other women from my barracks came around. They said, "She's nothing but a spy anyway." And they were going to do her in. They left. There was a day when we saw some planes. We were between two of their largest airfields. But this was a little plane that came low enough so that we could even see the American insignia on the outside of it. And he dropped something. It was a big metal thing. It was an auxiliary gas tank, but I didn't know at the time. And there were children out there. And he was waving, and I thought, "You dummy, didn't you see those children?" He went off, waggling his wings like that. And the next day, I didn't realize it at the time, he was trying to make us to know that more planes were coming. The next day, because in all those years we never had one package from Red Cross, we never had one letter from anywhere. We were locked in that little prison. And when we saw these great big double fuselage planes coming in, beautiful planes, and there were silver things coming out of the backs of the planes, and I yelled, "It's chocolate bars." Other bits, "No, it's canned goods." And everybody was saying it was something else. And it wasn't very long before we realized we were all wrong. They were bombing the camp. Mr. Yamaji had told us to make slit trenches near each one of our barracks. I ran and I jumped into that slit trench. The minute my feet hit the bottom of it, the Lord said to me, "You borrowed Mrs. Lee's English Bible." I said, "You're right, Lord. I have no right to let that burn." Everything was going up in flames. And I ran into the barracks and I grabbed it off of my upper rack where I slept. And I came out and I saw that they'd finally opened the gates down there and everybody was running toward it to get away from everything was in flames. And so I got down there and here were all of their machine guns set up. So they machine gunned the planes. The planes went right over and machine gunned us again. And I dropped my head. I said, "If anybody's alive at the end of this day, it will be a miracle." At the end of the day, I found Mrs. Presswood, fellow missionary. I said, "Let's go up. Maybe we can find our cans out of which we've been eating." Things like that. When I got back there to where the barracks had been and where my bed had been, it had fallen down. Nobody knew I had a 5-year diary sewn inside of the mat that I slept on. And I had my bride's book. I saw it on the pile of ashes. The gold had been purified in the fire. It stood out so beautifully on that black charred page. When I saw it, I said, "Father, I don't have one thing from my married life." I said, "Could I not have that?" But the minute I touched it, it disintegrated, it was totally gone. I said, "Couldn't I have had that?" And he said, "My child, that's what I want to do with you. I want to make you like pure gold, even if I have to take you through the fire 7 times. I bowed before my God. I said, "Here I am, Father." Just then I saw that the head of the barracks next to me was crying. I went over and put my arm around her and I said, "Don't cry." She said, "But my mattress burned." It was just a little pad that they allowed her to have. I said, Yes, everything's burned. Everything's gone. She said, but I didn't leave it in the barracks. I took it out and I threw it in that ditch that slit trench where you always lie when there are bombings. I walked over to that slit trench right where I had been when the bombing was going on. And the Lord reminded me that I had borrowed Mrs. Lee's English Bible. I walked over to that slit trench. I looked down, and right where I had been was the ashes of her mattress and what was left of the bomb. I've never known such quietness before my God. Said, it wasn't Mrs. Lee's Bible you wanted me to get, was it? You wanted to get me out of that slit trench to save my life. I said, Lord, whatever it takes, I want to be like the gold I saw on my bride's book. If you have to take me through another fire, crying to the Lord to have mercy on me. And about midnight, he was home with his Lord. Then the Americans came in. They were told not to take women and children, but if they could find the American men, and the American men were in probably as awful a condition as any men that had been in prisons. They'd been beaten with pipes. Water was poured into them with a hose, and then they jumped on them. I'll never forget the day when I went up and saw, and Mr. Yamaji arranged it so that I could go up and see Russell's grave. Then I came back, and I said, Lord, it wasn't very long ago I came here as a new bride. I'm going home, widowed, with not a thing in the world I could call my own. I was in borrowed clothes. I don't know if I'll ever come back to these islands again. Just then I heard the sound of running feet. I didn't want to turn around and look, but I did. There were those people that had come to know Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. They heard I was leaving. They came down. They started to sing, God be with you, till we meet again. I said, that's right, Lord. I didn't come here to have a happy married life. I came here because you sent me here. I turned around and I called out to them, as soon as I can, I will come home again. I have no regrets about anything. I'm glad he trusted me to take me through those years. The boys said, we're not supposed to take you, but we're going to take you. And the young man that came to get us, to get me, he saw me and he saw that I had no shoes at first. He said, don't you have any shoes? I said, no, everybody's barefoot. It's good for you. And I saw him looking at my bare feet, and he had the highly polished shoes on. I said, it's good for you to go barefoot. Then he said, I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. He said, my name is Tom Sawyer, and I'm from Los Angeles. It was on the tip of my tongue to say, sure, and here's Becky Thatcher. But I thought, no, watch it. He probably has been teased about his name. But he said, we're going to do a free drop of food, and then you're going with us on each stop. We'll put you on the last plane load out
of each place. Took me first to Borneo, then on up to the Palawan Islands. I'll never forget that day when we landed on the sand on the beach. And I saw that all the boys were in their dress uniforms, white, beautiful. They looked so nice. And they were on the steps going up to this mess hall on either side. And I whispered to Margaret Kemp, who came with me. Philoma wouldn't come. And I said, Margaret, they're expecting some very high officers or something. I said, look at them. And then the boys came and they said, no, come. So I went, and when I stepped between those first two boys, up came their hands to salute. I lost it. I started to cry. Each of them would say, it's all right. You're safe now. I got up into the mess hall, and they unfurled Old Glory, and then I just sobbed, and the band began to play the Star Spangled Banner. Oh, they were so kind. They wanted to feed us and feed us some more. Then we were taken on up, got to Manila. The doctor came to see me. He just put down a great handful of vitamins. Oh, he said, you're in bad condition. I said, I know what you're going to do. You're trying to fill me up with all those vitamins, and then I won't have any room to eat. No. He says, I want you to eat everything in sight that you find. Then I went to see if there was any mail there. We had never had mail. We never had anything to tell us even what was happening in the world. We'd been totally locked away. And I'd heard nothing from my family from the very beginning. And I went to this boy that was dealing out the letters that had come in. And I said, have you any mail for Darlene Deibler? And after about the third or fourth day coming there, he just said, boy, I don't know why somebody wouldn't write to you. I was so embarrassed. I didn't know either why somebody wouldn't write to me. And I didn't go back again until the last day when the ship came in and they were going to send us on home. Got on that ship, and so many of us, POWs, that we were sleeping 3 deep in hammocks out on the deck. That was just great. We finally came to Los Angeles, and when we went, or San Francisco, and when we went under that Golden Gate, that is a beautiful sight. And everybody was singing, I Lost My Heart in San Francisco. And they said, isn't it beautiful? You're not singing. I said, I never lost anything out here. I said, I'm from Iowa. And then it said, they called, pull it out, every berth is filled. So I thought, oh good, I'll be on this ship. I don't know what I'm going to do when we finally dock somewhere and we have to get off. It took us 2 days up to Seattle, Washington. Got there. We were sleeping on hammocks, 3 deep, out on the deck because there were so many POWs on that ship. And when everybody had left and everybody had folks coming to get them, and I got in under those hammocks, and I said, I know my family. I said, Lord, if Daddy and Mother were alive, they would have tried to find me. So they must be gone. And my brothers would be in the war. And I said, so they too maybe are gone. And as I dropped to my knees and started to cry, I heard his voice saying, my child, you can still trust me. I said, all right, Lord, help me to find a Red Cross woman. Maybe I can get some money and get back to Iowa and find somebody that knows me. And I just went out on the deck then, and there was a Red Cross woman, and I latched onto her. I said, you have to help me now. I said, I'm a POW. I just got in, and I don't know where my family is. She said, honey, what's your name? I said, Darlene Deibler. She said, I've been on the ship all morning looking for you. But you see, God wanted me to meet him first. I opened up the telegram. My hands were shaking so badly she had to do it for me. And I read, we moved to Oakland, California 2 years ago. But when they took you on up to Seattle, we couldn't get there in time to meet you. But we have sent money for you. Go to Western Union, pick that up, get a ticket on the train, and then we'll all be here to meet you. My sister and her husband and their daughter had also gone out to California. She said, when you get to a telephone, call us. This is our number. Love, Mother. So I went and got the money, and then I went to the train station. And when I told him that I wanted a ticket to California, he said, my dear, don't you know a war's been on? Nobody travels but Army, Navy personnel. And then I started to cry. I said, no, I didn't know that. I said, I'm a POW, and I haven't heard anything from my folks. And he said, don't cry. And he reached back and he got a ticket, and I was in business again. He said, I've got tickets for people like you. He said, tonight, when the train goes, I'll be here. I'll help you get on the train. And then I saw the telephone booth. And, well, when I left the States, all you had to do was just take up the receiver, and the little voice said, number, please. And I looked at that thing, and here was a circle there, and there were letters and numbers, and when all else fails, read the instruction. I read them, and it still failed. I stood there looking at that thing, and a man must have seen that I was having a problem, and he opened the door a little bit. He said, could I be of help? I said, yes, I've never seen a phone like this. I said, what do you do with that thing? He said, I'll show you. Have you got the number? I said, yes, it's here. So he came, and he dialed the number. He said, they're picking up the receiver, and he handed me the receiver to me, and he went out. And I heard a voice on the other end say, hello, Darlene. And I knew it was Mother. Nobody ever said my name like my mother did. She said, we knew you were on that ship, but we couldn't get up in time to Seattle to meet you. And we're here. You got the money. And I said, That's all I could say. I couldn't say anything else. I was crying so hard. And she said, are you all right? I said, She said, Raymond, that was my younger brother, had been in Germany. She said he arrived in last night. His first question was, Mother, have you heard anything from Darlene? And she said, we told him that you were coming, that you were to be in Seattle today. Did you get your ticket? She said, all right, Daddy, the rest of us are all fine. We'll be here waiting for you tomorrow morning when the train comes in. And I said, When I got down to halfway down to California, I realized that I hadn't told them what time I was coming in. So I stopped and I sent a telegram to them. And I said, kill the fatted calf. Love, Darlene. You know what that means, don't you? Daddy told me that when, in the middle of the night, they heard the phone, Mother jumped up and went to the phone, and he said, all I could hear was, what? She said it about 4 times. And finally, the lady laughed when she said, kill a fatted calf. The mother said, what? Said, arriving at such and such a time. And then she ran in and she jumped on the bed and shook my father and said, she's all right. She hasn't lost her sense of humor. That train came in. I was looking for just two faces to begin with. And when I saw my daddy and my mother running, because I was up at the front, just then, as I looked up at the sky, the clouds parted asunder and the sun shone through. I said, Lord, if it's like this to meet our loved ones that we haven't seen for so long, what will it be like when those clouds part asunder and Jesus will be there? We have a wonderful Lord. I'm so grateful that God did not leave anything out. I have nothing but love and praise and gratitude that he allowed me to go through those years. And if you don't know him, you will have missed knowing the most wonderful, loving person, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, the Savior of men. May he wonderfully bless you tonight. And know this, that whom the Lord loves, he always disciplines. Trust him. I thank you for the privilege of being here tonight. If I ever come to mind, pray for me. God bless you.